A young king gambles his entire nation on one rich province. An empress vows revenge at any cost. This is the Silesian Wars, 3 brutal conflicts that would explode into the 7 Years' War, fought across 5 continents. Frederick the Great's midnight invasion in 1740 didn't just start a regional war. It reshaped the European balance of power forever. But how did Silesia become worth centuries of bloodshed? And why did this conflict go global? In the shadowed corridors of 18th-century Europe, a storm brewed over the rich and strategic lands of Silesia, where verdant valleys and bustling towns became the stage for dynastic ambition and imperial rivalry. The House of Hohenzollern, rulers of Prussia, gazed longingly at this jewel of the Habsburg crown, not just for its wealth and taxes, industry and hardy recruits, but for its position as the keystone of Central Europe. To control Silesia was to possess a sword pointed at the heart of Bohemia and Moravia, a gate through the upper Oder Valley through which armies could march to shake the balance of power. It was more than land, it was leverage, a linchpin between East and West. With Silesia under Prussian command, the reach of Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into the Holy Roman Empire could be curbed. And so, in a clash not only of muskets and cavalry but of visions and empires, Frederick the Great set his gaze on Silesia, igniting the Silesian Wars, a series of brutal conflicts that would redefine power in Europe, and forever brand Prussia as a force to be reckoned with. In the tangled roots of Central European dynastic ambition, the seeds of the Silesian Wars were planted long before the first musket was fired. Deep in the annals of forgotten treaties and broken promises, the House of Hohenzollern nursed a claim to Silesia, kindled in 1537 when Duke Frederick II of Legnica signed a pact with Joachim II Hector of Brandenburg, promising the duchies of Liegnitz, Wola, and Brieg to the Hohenzollerns if the Piast line died out. Though King Ferdinand I of Bohemia, Silesia's Habsburg overlord, scorned the agreement and forced its renunciation, the flame of Hohenzollern ambition never dimmed. When Joachim III Frederick inherited Jagerndorf in 1603 and passed it to his son, the Habsburgs confiscated it after the 30 Years' War, yet the Hohenzollerns never ceased to call it theirs. Time and again, whether at the death of Duke George William in 1675 or amid the Great Turkish War, the emperors dangled lands, revoked them, or struck deals that were betrayed in shadowy corners of palaces. Even when Frederick III of Brandenburg bartered his family's claim for a handful of gold and momentary favor, the oath was broken the moment he wore a crown. For generations, Prussia's claim to Silesia was a wound wrapped in parchment and sealed with imperial hypocrisy, and when the moment came, Frederick the Great would open that wound with steel. In the tumultuous autumn of 1740, the death of Emperor Charles VI sent tremors through the foundations of the Habsburg Empire, and in that moment of imperial vulnerability, Frederick II of Prussia, newly crowned and brimming with ambition, saw not tragedy, but opportunity. With the ink still drying on his father's legacy of a disciplined army and a full treasury, Frederick turned his calculating gaze toward Silesia, a prize long claimed by the Hohenzollerns and now ripe for the taking. Though cloaked in the thin veil of legal inheritance rights, Frederick's ambitions were carved more by realpolitik than by parchment treaties. Austria, exhausted from recent war and unprepared for a fresh campaign, stood isolated, while Europe's great powers tangled elsewhere, Britain and France locked in colonial squabbles, Sweden eyeing Russia, and the electors of Bavaria and Saxony sharpening their own knives. When Maria Theresa, the young daughter of Charles VI, ascended the Habsburg throne under the fragile protection of the Pragmatic Sanction, the wolves began to circle. For Frederick, this was more than a dispute over land, it was a masterstroke of strategy, a chance to redraw the map of power. As snow fell on the plains of Central Europe, Prussia marched to war, and the age-old dispute over Silesia ignited into a fire that would scar the continent for years to come. As Europe held its breath in the uncertain wake of Emperor Charles VI's death, Frederick the Great sharpened both his quill and his sword. In a letter to Voltaire, he called the moment, the signal for the complete transformation of the old political system, and with those words the calculated ambitions of Prussia took flight. Maria Theresa's fragile claim, bolstered by the Pragmatic Sanction, offered no shield against Frederick's cunning. He dismissed the sanction's authority over Silesia, insisting it was imperial property, not hereditary Habsburg land. More than that, he accused Vienna of breaking faith, arguing that Prussia's prior assent to the sanction was conditional, a bargain made in expectation of Austrian support for Hohenzollern claims in Jülich and Berg, support that never came. But it wasn't just Frederick eyeing the Habsburg inheritance. Charles Albert of Bavaria and Frederick Augustus II of Saxony, both married into the elder branches of the Habsburg family, each reached for a crown that wasn't theirs. For Frederick, the stakes were existential. Saxony's dream of linking Poland and Silesia into a single crushing arc around Brandenburg was a nightmare he refused to let materialize. And so, with Europe distracted and Maria Theresa untested, Frederick seized the moment. The peace of the Old World cracked and Prussia marched forward, not only to claim a province, but to challenge the very balance of power in Europe. As the cold winds of December 1740 swept across Europe, Frederick II of Prussia made a bold and calculated move that would alter the fate of Central Europe. Just weeks after Emperor Charles VI's death, the young king demanded Silesia from Maria Theresa, cloaking his ambition in diplomacy, offering support, indemnities, and even a vote for her husband in the imperial election. But behind the courteous language loomed steel. On December 16, without waiting for an answer, Prussian troops stormed across the Silesian frontier, launching what would become the First Silesian War. In mere weeks, the prized region lay under Prussian control, with only a few Austrian strongholds holding out. The clash at Mollwitz in April 1741, where Prussia emerged victorious, shattered Austria's aura of strength, and like vultures to a wounded beast, France, Bavaria, Saxony, Spain, and Naples joined the fray, plunging Europe into the War of the Austrian Succession. While Frederick negotiated in secret, striking the Convention of Klein-Schnellendorf for peace, he soon sensed betrayal in Austria's stalling tactics. Trust shattered, he resumed his offensive, pushing deep into Moravia, reaching as far as Olmütz. Though Prussia's allies faltered, Frederick's resolve did not. At Kotusitz in May 1742, his forces once again stood their ground. Austria, bloodied and stretched thin, was finally forced to the table. With the Treaty of Breslau, Frederick emerged triumphant. Silesia was his, a glittering jewel torn from the Habsburg crown. The war had ended, but its echo would soon thunder again. Amid the ashes of uneasy peace, the fires of war rekindled. As Austria clawed back its strength, reclaiming Bohemia, pushing France across the Rhine and occupying Bavaria, Frederick the Great saw danger in every alliance inked against him. The Treaty of Worms in 1743 confirmed his deepest fears. Maria Theresa would not forget Silesia. So, in August 1744, with winter still distant and ambition burning hot, he struck again. The Second Silesian War had begun. Prussian forces surged into Bohemia, seizing Prague in a brilliant strike, but Austria, relentless and reborn, returned in force. Starved of supplies and hounded by Otto von Traun's cunning maneuvers, Frederick's army was forced into retreat. The tide turned again in June 1745, when Frederick's genius shone at Hohenfriedberg, shattering Austria's hopes of reclaiming Silesia. More victories followed, Sower, Hennersdorf and Kesselsdorf, each a blow to Austrian pride and Saxon ambition. As Prussian troops marched into Dresden, the will to fight faded. On Christmas Day 1745, peace was sealed in the Treaty of Dresden. Silesia remained Prussia's prize. Austria gained a crowned emperor in Francis I. And Frederick, having danced once more with fate and fire, emerged not just as a king, but as a master of European war. The peace that followed was no peace at all, only a breath held before the storm. Though the cannons fell silent after the Treaty of Dresden, the silence was heavy with unfinished business. Maria Theresa could not accept Prussia's grip on Silesia, refusing to grant the legal recognition that would legitimize Frederick's conquest. And Frederick, ever the calculating monarch, refused to acknowledge her right to the Bohemian crown. The war had paused, but its cause still smoldered. In those tense interbellum years, both powers quietly armed for the inevitable. Prussia became a fortress state, its borders bristling with new fortifications, its guns growing heavier, its coffers swelling with gold. Frederick played a masterful game of diplomacy, soothing Britain, pacifying Russia, and clinging tightly to France. Meanwhile, Austria transformed under Maria Theresa's iron will. Her chancellor revolutionized taxation, her generals remade the army in the Prussian mold, and her diplomats moved deftly, forging an alliance with Russia and, shockingly, reconciling with old enemy France. The balance of Europe began to tilt, and as the pieces locked into place, Prussia and Britain on one side, Austria, France and Russia on the other, the stage was set. The world would soon tumble into the chaos of another war. The fragile peace was over before it began. The Third Silesian War erupted like a thunderclap across Europe, and once again, it was Frederick who fired the first shot. Convinced that Austria, France and Russia were conspiring to crush Prussia, he moved preemptively, invading Saxony in August 1756 and throwing all of Europe into what would become the 7 Years' War. At first, it seemed Frederick's gamble would pay off. His forces surged through Saxony and into Bohemia, smashing through Austrian defenses at the Battle of Prague in May 1757. But that momentum came at a cost, and when Austria struck back at the Battle of Kolin, the Prussians were bloodied and driven out of Bohemia. It was a sobering defeat, and a turning point. To the east, Russian forces pushed into East Prussia, claiming victory at Grossjägersdorf, though supply issues slowed their advance. From the north, Sweden joined the fray, and to the west, France and the Holy Roman Empire tried to break Prussian control in Saxony. But Frederick struck back with terrifying precision. His crushing victory at the Battle of Rossbach in November 1757 humiliated the Franco-Imperial army, halting their advance and effectively knocking France out of serious contention in the Silesian theater. Just 1 month later, Frederick delivered another masterstroke at the Battle of Leuthen. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Prussians outmaneuvered the Austrians in a brilliant flanking attack that became one of history's most celebrated tactical victories. Silesia was saved once more, and the Austrians fled back into Bohemia. By winter's end, the tide had turned in the west too. A coordinated Prussian-Hanoverian campaign pushed the French out of Westphalia and across the Rhine, securing Prussia's vulnerable western frontier. But the war was far from over. Russia loomed in the east, Austria regrouped in the south, and the world's first true global conflict raged on. Frederick had won incredible victories, but the storm still gathered on every horizon. The Silesian Wars, 3 ferocious struggles over 2 decades, ended not only in blood and fire, but in a decisive reshaping of European power. Against the odds, Prussia emerged victorious, wresting Silesia from the grip of the Habsburgs and defending it through successive Austrian attempts to reclaim it. From the perspective of both contemporaries and modern historians, it was a clear triumph for Frederick the Great and his rising kingdom. What made this victory so impactful wasn't just territorial gain. Silesia was rich in resources, strategically located and symbolically potent. A longtime Habsburg possession that now stood as the crown jewel of Prussian ambition. The status quo antebellum terms of the Second and Third Silesian Wars only confirmed what had already become fact on the battlefield. Prussia would keep what it had taken. But the effects ran deeper. The wars shattered the old diplomatic order, triggering what became known as the Diplomatic Revolution, as age-old allies switched sides and Europe's alliances realigned in response to this new Prussian threat. And most crucially, they forged a lasting rivalry between Austria and Prussia, one that would dominate German politics and identity for the next 100 years, finally coming to a head in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, when the question of leadership in the German-speaking world was finally settled. In the end, the Silesian Wars were more than regional conflicts. They were the crucible in which modern Prussia was forged, and in which the seeds of Germany's future were sown. The Silesian Wars proved that 18th-century diplomacy was written in blood. Prussia's victory cost 500,000 lives but birthed a German superpower. Yet the unresolved tensions, they ignited the 7 Years' War just months later. Was Frederick truly great, or did he doom his people to endless war? The debate continues. Drop your take in the comments, and explore how this firestorm spread worldwide in our 7 Years' War deep dive.